how's it going?
It's going extremely well, and yourself?
I'm pretty excited about today's guest, and if I'm totally honest, a little bit nervous too. Today, we are going to be speaking with Dr. Dirk Huyer, who is the Chief Coroner of Ontario. And I'm going to be fully transparent here to our listeners that I have had the chance to meet Dirk in the past because he's actually my husband's boss's boss. So there's all these connections, and I've had the privilege of discussing medical assistance in dying with him in the past, but I'm pretty excited about doing it today because there's an awful lot I didn't know about the role of the Office of the Chief Coroner in thinking about MAiD and collecting data and making recommendations so that we do things a little bit better. And I can't wait for Dirk to unpack some of that for us.
Myself as well. As someone who has lived in several provinces in Canada, I appreciate that the role of Chief Coroner varies from province to territory. And I'm really interested in hearing what it looks like for our listeners who live in Ontario, and hopefully for those who live outside of Ontario to really ask those questions about the role of the coroner in MAiD throughout the country.
Because as we know, and as we mentioned probably ad nauseum with our podcast, the legislation for MAiD is federal, but how each province does it is a little bit different. And so while our focus today will be very Ontario-centric, because Dirk is the Chief Coroner of Ontario, I strongly encourage and challenge our listeners. Go find out what's happening in your province in terms of what kind of data is being collected, what kind of oversight is happening, and see how it compares. And don't hesitate to reach out to us on our socials and let us know what you've learned. So let's get the conversation with Dr. Huyer started. Dr. Huyer, could we please start off with you telling us and our listeners a little bit about what the Office of the Chief Coroner does and about your role specifically?
Great to be here. The Office of the Chief Coroner in Ontario is responsible for investigation of deaths that are looked at as sudden and unexpected, where people were surprised and that a planned death or a death that's at the end of a trajectory of a long illness, or something that might be violent or anything unnatural. So drug toxicity, any sort of circumstance where there might have been something other than disease that occurred. And our role, which is a physician-led death investigation system, is to provide answers to questions about the death so that the families, communities, friends, and the public, as we are permitted to, are aware and understand what happened. And that information is so important to families when really it was an unexpected event. And then as we're learning about the circumstances, we may identify some issues, something within that death that may indicate a recommendation that we could make to try to reduce the chance of further deaths happening. And so we might identify that issue and therefore take that information, look to potential organization or somewhere within the government or somewhere else where we could make recommendation to prevent further deaths. And those are the key roles that we provide. We do it in various ways. We bring the medical skill as the physicians and healthcare professionals and work together with investigators from the police who are skilled in investigation. The two come together to be able to do the best job of answering the questions.
And that's a huge job that I think most of our listeners might be a little bit unfamiliar with thinking about the coroner system. And I know I'm of the mindset that there's a lot of power in death and that we can learn a lot about that and how it can sort of front load how we are within other systems and how we can use death to help us to live better. So what is your role in all of that then?
Yeah. My specific role is that I'm the chief coroner, so appointed by the government as the person who has the responsibility for administering the Coroners Act. And the Coroners Act is the legislation that provides the framework for the work that we do in investigating deaths. So my role is really to lead the organization and to ensure that death investigations are done to the highest quality across the province for all of those who have suffered tragic loss. And it's not surprising, and in fact, it's probably a good thing that many people in the public aren't aware of what we do, because then they haven't suffered the tragedy, the unexpected tragedy. And it's always sad for me when I intersect with those who have to intersect with us, because it's accompanied by a significant emotion, it's a loss, and really trying to understand what's happened. And it's so variable across the families and those who are loved ones of those who have suffered, who have lost somebody. And really, the emotion is so variable and the questions are so different. And really, what our job is to work together with those who have suffered that loss, give them the answers, and then, as I say, take the voice of the person who died and try to inform change to make things better.
Thank you for that. Dirk, perhaps you could comment a little bit on how the introduction of MAiD legislation since 2016 has affected the responsibilities of the coroner's office here in Ontario.
Yeah, in 2016, the Criminal Code of Canada was amended to permit healthcare professionals to either provide or prescribe medications to allow the death of a person to occur. And that came on very quickly. The legislation was passed federally, and then the next day was brought in force, which is atypical of legislation, where usually there's a period of time that occurs for people to prepare for that. When that occurred, the provincial government in Ontario felt it would be important for Ontario to have clear and direct oversight and understanding of the deaths that occurred from medical assistance in dying. And they asked our office to step forward to provide that initial review of any deaths that occurred from medical assistance in dying. And it fell within our legislative framework of the Coroners Act, because at the root of things, deaths that occur in medical assistance in dying are from drugs. So the medication that's been provided. And so it fell within our legislation because it would be a non-natural death as far as the cause as apart from disease. And so it fell within our legislation by the strict interpretation of legislation. And we took that on as asked as a temporary basis to provide that oversight. And we quickly developed a process of what information we needed to access and to evaluate to ensure that the steps that were taken followed legislation. So made sure that they complied with the legislation, the Criminal Code of Canada, which is very uncommon in medicine. Medicine typically is not driven by legislation, particularly the Criminal Code. So that in of itself was unusual. The colleges of physicians and surgeons and colleges of nurses and pharmacists had developed some guidelines. And so we utilized those guidelines, we utilized the Criminal Code, and we applied that framework to our review of the deaths. That was the way we started. And so every death that occurred was called to us by the healthcare professional who had provided MAiD, and we had disseminated that out through the Ministry of Health and their guidance around MAiD. And then we also transferred every deceased person into our care for examination, because again, that would be the process that we would follow when somebody died from a non-natural process. So we were really, to some extent, limited by our legislation and what was available to allow us to do that. We made a decision to collect blood in all of those cases. We did not do testing, and we did not do further intrusive examination in the form of an autopsy, but we did do a full examination by a forensic pathologist in the early days. That was transitioning into a new medical practice that was unusual, where society was wondering about things. The government themselves were concerned about ensuring compliance with everything that's in place. And so we took that role on in the interim while Ontario was determining what would be the next steps that would follow from the implementation of the new legislation that the federal government passed.
That sounds like a whole layer of complexity added to your office around that oversight. And Keri-Lyn and I have done some research with people who've accompanied someone whose person used MAiD at the end of their lives. And in the early days, as you were talking about, we used to hear from people, they would talk about, yeah, we were sitting at the kitchen table and sometimes the MAiD provider was still there, and then the phone would ring and it would be the coroner's office. So I'm assuming, Dirk, that wasn't necessarily you who called each and every family.
No, in the early days it was. I was the
Okay.
first recipient, so we didn't have a team. And we made a decision that we would centralize the process early on, and we had a small number of people. So it was actually myself as a chief coroner and 2 deputy chief coroners that did the initial calls.
Okay.
And then as more came, the regional supervising coroners, so our management structure is, our leadership and management is chief coroner, 2 deputies, now 13 regional supervising coroners. We stepped out to the regional coroners over time as we had more deaths occurring. And the reason we kept it centralized is it was way too fast coming on, and to be able to educate and to guide coroners on how they would be able to investigate these deaths or do oversight, which is completely contrary to the work that we do. So remember, the work we do is to try to prevent death. MAiD deaths are not to be prevented in most of the circumstances. Needs to be a robust analysis and a careful thought and assessment from a holistic view, in my view. But we're really, it's contrary to the work that we do. So it didn't fall within the typical approach that we take. And so therefore, when we were asked to do that, we centralized, and we did that with a process that would be different, but yet still, how can we learn? How can we inform? How can we enhance MAiD practice by our observations? So very tricky and very much contrary to what would be the typical healthcare approach, which is a culture of improvement, should be a culture of improvement, quality improvement. We fit into that in an unusual way. We also knew that there were coroners who had their strong views, as in other healthcare practitioners, and that's something that we wanted to respect and recognize. But having those views potentially impacting the investigation could have had a more challenging impact on those who had received MAiD, but also in the way to learn about the changes that were occurring as MAiD was implemented in the healthcare field.
I really appreciate, Dirk, that you developed your comments into that area. Kathy and I have done research with people, and we've come across conscientious objection and people who've had experiences in the healthcare system with people who refused. And then, of course, it was mandated that you had a duty to refer here in Ontario. What about the Office of the Coroner? Had there been some pushback? As you say, the legislation happened very quickly. People had to run before they walked, if that's fair. And I was very curious to hear more about whether there had been people who said to you as chief coroner and to your team, no, this is not what I signed up for. Could you comment a little bit on that further for us, please?
Yes, at the investigating coroner level, we did hear that. There is one investigating coroner who will not even participate in authorizing the cremation of a person if, in fact, they had been subject to MAiD, and had to develop their own approach to how would they determine that. Because in Ontario, medical assistance in dying is not noted on the medical certificate of death. So it require further evaluation to determine that question. And that's how strong that person felt. I think that what I encourage people to think about in our office is the reality is we're investigating after the decisions have been made and after processes occur. And so we'll support that as long as it doesn't impact the process. More thoughtfully, we recognize that there are a number of complexities with medical assistance in dying, and it's contrary to what typical work that we do. So recognizing that is why we, following legislative change, which the government in Ontario and the legislature determined that we were the best organization to provide the oversight. Following that, recognize that because it's different, we needed to do something different. So we stayed with the centralized process, but we also brought together a group of healthcare professionals, specifically registered nurses, who we have trained and have now significant experience and expertise in doing evaluations and reviews of these circumstances, because now they're not investigations. They are reviewed to determine if an investigation is required under the Coroners Act, and that's the way it was written. And so that provides that opportunity for a smaller group of people to focus in a different way, which is focus on compliance, focus on learning, focus on determining whether investigation is necessary, and focusing on recommendations to improve MAiD practice, as opposed to preventing further deaths. So that was why we made a decision to do that. And we also made a decision to allow greater competency and experience and skill to develop with a smaller group. Because we have about 300 coroners across the province, and they're working as healthcare professionals for the majority of their time in their careers and their professional work. So trying to educate people with the complexities of MAiD review is difficult, especially if you do a small number of cases. So if you investigate on average about 50 to 60 per year of deaths, generally, trying to keep up with all of the different types of deaths is difficult, and MAiD in of itself has even more complexities. And so that is where we went and made the decision to proceed with a smaller group that has that ability to gain the competencies and knowledge and learn about the providers.
And I think that that is essential to this kind of new movement or this new option that's available to Canadians, specifically in Ontario. And I know when I spend time on social media or even just reading media in general, one of the big arguments is that there isn't enough oversight around medical assistance in dying, and that people aren't watching what's happening, and everybody can access MAiD, and not everybody hangs out in the coroner system. And so can you be really specific, Dirk, and let our listeners know what is that oversight and what exactly happens afterwards to monitor how MAiD is happening in Ontario?
Yeah, it's a very important question. And I think that there are variable views on what oversight is. And so our perspective is that we believe oversight is a number of things. One is a compliance with legislation, compliance with process. And so it's very clear. Legislation lays out what can happen. But that's not solely the way to analyze it. So we do a holistic look at the MAiD process to the point of death. When we look specifically at the death, our process is that we have a standardized reporting for all deaths that allows us to collect information, but also to measure against the legislation, measure against proper procedure that are recognized procedures. And the team will receive that electronically. So the provider will provide all of that information or submit all that information electronically, which then goes to one of the registered nurses who look very clearly at those reports. And if there's anything unusual, then seek additional information. We have the ability to seek any information that we think is necessary. And that could be talking to people, could be records, could be any types of information that we think we need. And so they will look at it with a standard approach and seek additional information if necessary. And we always speak to the families. Not 100%, because sometimes there aren't families, but the vast majority of times there are. And we have an open-ended conversation with the family, seeking their input, what their thoughts were about the process, were there any concerns with the process of assessment and provision, and then the procedure, and also any general concerns that they have about what happened before. So all the records related to medical assistance in dying, and those are deaths that would be defined as track 2 or not reasonably foreseeable natural deaths. Those all go through a greater degree of review. Anytime that there's any concerns about potential cognitive impact, so if dementia is raised on the report, if there's any other cognitive impact that might be there on neurodevelopment or neurodegenerative disease or something of that nature, if there's a diagnosis of frailty, that's something that still is less specific, so we evaluate those in greater detail. If there's a couple that may have MAiD concurrent, we look at those in greater detail as well. And so the providers are expected to send us all of the records, and the team can also access more records as necessary to be able to fully understand it. And those will be reviewed with the manager of the team as well, often with me, if there's questions. So those are another subset. And then the final subset, which are where the providers are asked to call the team immediately, so they're always 24/7 available, is when the underlying disease, condition, or disability might have arisen from an injury event. Sometimes people have injuries to their spinal cord, and that leads to complications, which then has physical suffering and psychological suffering reported by the requester. Those are coroners' investigations, remember back to thinking about what coroners do, any non-natural event, and therefore those are ones that we would investigate to see if there is something from a coroner's point of view that might lead to recommendations separate from MAiD to try to prevent further deaths. So that's the reviewing process. Then we take all of the information that's obtained through that electronic reporting and we analyze that information to look for trends and patterns. And those we report. So we think that reporting from a public transparency is important so people understand what's going on. And we're just about to release a number of reports. One, looking at our 2023 data overall. And then we have other reports that are going to come out that help people to understand. So we think reporting is very important as far as data sharing. We'll take that information and share that with those who are in a position to take further steps. When we find a challenge, we then will provide feedback to the providers and we track that feedback. So if there's non-compliance on more than one occasion, then we might see a pattern and report that to the licensing body. So back to the report, when we see a problem, when that one problem occurs, we look at the whole case presentation and we say, does that one problem actually define the case as a non-compliance? Or does the rest of everything else fit together well? And that we look at their diagnostic approach through that and their goal approach. And if we think it's a small piece, still an important piece, we will provide that feedback, but not then say that defines the whole presentation. We need to report to the police or report to the College of Physicians and Surgeons or nurses. So we try to look at this holistically. The last thing we do in all of that, and it's all through this whole process, is how does the healthcare provider work that they did, how does that fit within what we know is MAiD practice? So the team see approximately 400 deaths per month. So they have substantial experience on what is practice that occurs now in Ontario, and they look at outliers as far as diagnostic approach. And those will then come for further discussion and evaluation at my level and the team's level. So we'll have team discussions, and those we may report to the College of Physicians and Surgeons, because it's not our job to determine if they're following their regulatory body work. But if we see something, we raise that to the attention of the regulatory body. And then finally, we have a new committee called the MAiD Death Review Committee, and that's composed of 16 experts in their own domains that bring together a diverse viewpoint to help us to look at themes or trends that help us to think about, could we do oversight differently? That's so our own reflection, but also what can we learn from this to again provide recommendations or to reflect on the approaches that we're taking. So it's a multi-layered approach to review the individual case, but then looking at it from a systemic perspective and then taking those systems learnings to the policy tables and the legislative tables. I hope that answered the question.
Dirk, you mentioned families and how you will interact with families, et cetera, in that posthumous space. And Kathy and I have had some experience in the research with people who are navigating a MAiD death or somebody who had opted for MAiD provision at end their life. And there have been instances where there's been discord within a family, chosen or otherwise, about the individual's choice. Kathy and I were very curious if you'd let our listeners know, has there been a challenge that you can tell us about for your office?
We reviewed upwards of deaths last year, so we have challenges on a regular basis. And it depends what you describe as challenge. For us, a lens of review, as we've talked about, and that lens of review identifies concerns at times. And some of those concerns are ones that we identify that the family may not. And they may be procedural, provisional based. They may be the assessment type of approach. So it's variable. If you go to a family related concern, there are families strongly opposed to MAiD and voice that opposition as the providers and the assessors were wrong. And they strongly feel that the providers and assessors coerced the patient into the MAiD provision. They themselves believe that the provider and assessor did not do a thorough assessment and believe their loved one was not eligible. And so that would be one end of the continuum. And then they can go all the way across to fully supporting the assessors and providers that may be where there might have been additional perspectives taken or other expertise that could have been involved from our perspective. So you can look at those as challenges in either way, right? And we try to bring a neutral, balanced approach and, in fact, informed approach. But in anything that you do, when there's humans involved and without being able to talk to the deceased person, it's very difficult. So we are challenged by trying to determine about coercion, trying to determine about capacity because we weren't there. We rely on the information that's provided to us. So that can be one of the most significant challenges in the review or investigation process, is to be able to answer that question. And there's no easy way to do it, but we're continuing to refine and think about that. We rely on practitioners' documentation, on their words to us, on the family's words to us. And as you can imagine, as I said, some of those perceptions are provided within a lens of what they thought was the right thing to do. Trying to unpack that in a scientifically driven death investigation system can be very challenging. That's why we bring the team together and have these conversations. It's also why we felt important to have additional capacity in the Medical Assistance in Dying Death Review Committee, which brings further perspectives and expertise to the table to provide us, again, further robustness to our reviews.
Dirk, just to clarify for our listeners, because this was something that really resonated with me when I first learned about the role of the coroner's office with MAiD. So every single MAiD death that occurs in Ontario is reviewed by a nurse on the MAiD team in your office.
That's correct.
But also then thinking about, as you have said, that there were 4,500 deaths in Ontario from MAiD, and there are a number of opponents of MAiD. And I'm thinking particularly of the recent report from Cardis. I don't know, Dirk, if you're familiar with this. Cardis, of course, being that think tank. And they are talking about this idea that initially with MAiD, it was intended to be, and this is a quote from the report, a stringently limited option, but now it's routine. And so 4,500 deaths in Ontario does seem like a lot. And this Cardis is finding that only 3% of requests for MAiD are actually denied, and that the assessments for MAiD could be done in a single day, which was not the way the legislation was laid out initially. So how do you balance the ethical and legal pieces in terms of what people are hoping for in how your team views the assessments around MAiD?
Yeah, it's a very challenging question. And I think we have a role, but we're not the role. So in other words, there's many people that are involved in recognizing and thinking about MAiD and the policy of MAiD and people's perspectives of MAiD. From a healthcare perspective, there are very few things that I can think of where there's a requirement for two independent practitioners to make a decision. There are certainly circumstances in healthcare where other healthcare professionals are asked to be involved to give difference of opinions, but this is pretty defined. That is definitely unique in medicine that I can think about. It's difficult to know how many are assessed and not provided. We don't know that information, but we're going to look at that and try to understand it. And it's something that we take very seriously. This is a very important thing that occurs in healthcare in Ontario and in Canada. And we continue to try to provide the most robust information, the most robust understanding of what's occurring to inform those discussions. Cardis brings a perspective that's very important in sharing information, and people who are thinking about this need to consider multiple different views. Ours is one that, as I say, we try to provide information and data. And while doing that, we try to provide the most robust review we can within the information that's available to us. We bring that forward. And if we see specific areas that we think are trends or themes, bring those to the attention of others, everybody. And when there's an outlier as far as practice goes, we bring those to attention. But I think the outliers are different than a systemic response. The outliers are typically not representative of the systemic challenges. The systemic challenges are ones that I think are those that need to be discussed by many. We're not going to figure that all out because we're not positioned to be able to. We don't have that skill set or that role, to be frank. People, I think, put roles onto our work that may not be something we can achieve. So I'll use a comparator. 100 people die per year from drug toxicity, specifically opioid toxicity. We report on that. We bring that forward on a regular basis. We tell people what's occurring with this tragedy, but we're not in a position to specifically understand exactly how to fix it. But it's important to bring it forward, and it's important to have those conversations. And so similarly in MAiD, I'm not saying it's broken. I'm not saying it's fixed. I'm saying MAiD is currently evolving. Practice is evolving. People are learning, and those discussions need to occur. And we're trying to bring that information forward in as clearly and in a robust way to be able to allow people to carry those conversations on, to inform those conversations, as opposed to be the determinant of whether the practice is bad. It's really about individual circumstances, then bringing systemic information forward. We're open to thinking about how to do things differently. It's what we try to do to bring forward to help people to carry these conversations forward.
I think that's very helpful, Dirk. And I'm going to reinforce a statement you made: a role, not the role. And I think that's really important for our listeners to understand, and for myself to understand, that you're part of a machine with many moving parts. Kathy and I had a question, but I'm going to preface it by saying, I work in hospice and palliative care spaces. And as a squishy little human with lots of emotions and things that I carry, I'm offered something called supervision, which means that I get to check in with someone to process the things that I see and experience in the work that I do. As the Chief Coroner of Ontario, and as somebody who's been in the coroner's office for decades, and you've got this team now dedicated to MAiD death, et cetera, and you talk very much about that idea of looking at the constellation, so being able to move in for the narrow focus, but moving out. So all of these things that are expected of you and your team, how do you take care of yourselves?
Yeah, it's a really important thing to think about in all the work that we do. So I lead an organization that is driven by tragedy. It's terrible. Like everything that we do every day, there's some form of tragedy that's occurred. The simple answer is focusing on making things better. So providing answers and making things better. So if we can help people to understand what happened to their loved one, that's fundamentally important and powerful in my mind. And then secondarily, what can we learn from the voice of that person who died to try and make things better? So that's how I live and that's how I function. And the big important thing is I'm self-selected, right? I used to work at sick children's where I assessed kids where they were potentially abused and suffered, and families were being torn apart, and there's criminal charges and tragedy upon tragedy. And then I go into death investigation concurrently, and that's fine. I'm fine. And so I missed the importance of recognizing whether I'm fine or not is another issue. But the perspective is that I didn't build and think about wellness in a way that I should have in our organization because I became self-selected up. And so missed the fact that others in similar roles weren't as fine as I think I am. And so we have been working to think about how to do that. And we still have a long way to go. There is lots of supports available, lots of conversation. We talk about wellness now much more often. And so that's the general approach. Specifically with the medical assistants in dying, in our interviews, we evaluate this with the people that are going to join. It's hard to understand what it actually means when you're just doing an interview for the job. But throughout, we have regular meetings. The team works together, and we keep an eye on each other to support each other. We have conversations about all of this, reflecting on the tragedy that they are seeing as well. The people's journeys through the healthcare system or other systems. And so these are topics that we maintain on a regular basis. We don't have a structured everyday approach. It's really organic and flows with what's happening within, watching the amount of work that people are doing. So we have a way to analyze the number of reviews that are assigned because you can't predict the number in a day. When there's moral distress, we bring the team together and talk about that as well. So I think to some extent, it's the structured approach that allows it to occur. But we also changed our process of review to align with what we thought was the best approach. So the approach of investigation was responding to what the challenges the team had. So from a workload, simple, not the challenges of the cases, but the workload, we responded to that. We controlled and evaluated and listened to the things that we could alter, and we could alter that. And that changed the work for the team. I will tell you, when we said you're going to have to phone them at 24, 48 hours later, that is not going to be good. We're going to be intruding on people. We're not going to be able to answer the questions. It's the wrong time. It's like, they're really not going to be able to help, and it's going to disrupt them. Now they've turned around with a semi-structured, open-ended approach to them. They're now like, this is so much better. Now the families are comfortable to talk to us. They can breathe. They're not sitting at the table, as you said earlier, sitting at the table with the provider right beside. They're comfortable to talk. They're outside of that immediate moment of thinking. The providers aren't talking in a clinical way at the bedside. So it's a long answer to your question, but it's something we think about all the time, something we try to think about in advance and check in during the time. We have a manager who's a nurse practitioner, registered nurse, who does regular check-ins with the team on a one-to-one basis, but also she and I are scanning for potentially challenging cases, and there will be reach outs that we do on occasion. And we try to ensure that everybody's involved in everything. So when there's something new or learning, we talk about it. There's a change in where we're going. If we had an unusual, challenging circumstance, get everybody's opinion and thinking about it. They're very collegial. They share work around when they're overworked and over volume as well.
And I would imagine, Dirk, that the work that you do is meaningful. This idea, and I have the privilege of hanging out with more coroners than probably most people do. And I love this colloquial statement that I hear thrown out, that coroners speak for the dead to protect the living, right? And so it's that idea of what can we learn from why or how deaths occurred to improve the quality of life for people. We talked earlier a little bit about some of the differences between provinces, and I'm going to ask the question, I know you're going to roll your eyes at me, Dirk, but about death certificates in Ontario and how in Ontario we don't put MAiD as being the cause of death, but in another province like BC, they do. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the thinking around that?
Yeah. So if you think about a medical certificate of death, what is the purpose? So what is the purpose of a medical certificate of death, number one? And I'll talk about that in a minute. But what is the purpose of putting MAiD on or not putting MAiD on? So a medical certificate of death, there's two purposes. One, it's the demographics of the information, which is to allow the government to register the death. And so it's the legal confirmation within the organization that this death has occurred. And that leads to estate management, that leads to benefits, it leads to stop of pay, banking, insurance, Canada Pension, stopping health card, driver's licenses, all that's the legal part of it. So that's the first portion of the medical certificate of death. Fundamentally, that's what the role is. On top of that, the medical certificate of death was added to allow the medical information to be brought forward. So that medical information is then collected at the same time, and that's done to allow an understanding of medically what types of illnesses, diseases, conditions occur within the population of the particular area you're in. So it allows you to understand what is the disease burden, what are the types of diseases. That allows you to inform your research, allows you to inform your funding, allows you to inform your workforce, allows you to inform prevention strategies, all of those interventions that occur from that. So that's the general purpose for it. So putting MAiD on there, what would be the purpose? The purpose is to count number of MAiD deaths. If that's the only purpose, it would be there, because it's not going to inform any other health conditions, because you actually don't have the health condition. So putting that MAiD to count on is why it might be there in some jurisdictions. And if you think about the type of oversight that we have or others have, others don't have substantial oversight, so they may not have the count of their MAiD deaths. That might be the way they count deaths. Some would argue that's transparency. I understand that argument, but in Ontario, we have another process to count. If the providers are not reporting to us, they're breaking the law. So the Coroners Act says they must report those. I don't think they're not being reported. There might be, but then how am I going to know because you're not reported? I think I don't think there's any, if they are, they're nefariously doing something else as well. So they're breaking the law. So from our perspective, the benefit of it being there would actually be a detriment to the collection of the underlying disease, condition, or disability that led to their decision to seek MAiD. For me, it's important that we have the broad health perspective. We meet that need of the medical collection of information. So while I understand the desire to have MAiD there, our numbers would still be captured within there. And the reason it's not in Ontario is because of concern that either the institution or the provider would be subject to negative interaction from those who are not believing of MAiD. So potentially similar to what occurred many years ago with abortion, and that providers some were attacked. There was lots of negative connotations to the work that they did and negative from the public. And so a medical certificate of death can be accessed by some in the public, not that easily, but it can be accessed if you know a certain amount of information. So it put the providers potentially at risk, was the belief of the government, because the government is the one who made the decision that you could not release those names. The medical certificate of death was interpreted to be a potential way that could occur. So the Registrar General made the determination that they would not include MAiD. So that's different views, different processes. I understand the simplistic view that hides MAiD. There's no hiding of MAiD in our perspective in my mind.
I think that's very helpful, Dirk, really, because we have heard from some of our research participants that there was some concern, not necessarily that MAiD perhaps was being hidden, but that there was contribution to a sort of if there was a reluctance to see it on a MAiD, on a death certificate. And I think that's very important for we lay people to understand here in Ontario. Given that you were there at the onset of the legislation in Ontario, and as you've said already for our listeners, that you were single-handedly often the person who got the call in the early days, do you have advice or any kind of things that you've ascertained in the role as Chief Coroner that you would like family and friends of people who opt for MAiD to know about?
That's a difficult question to easily answer. What I'm seeing over time is as people understand and learn more about medical assistance in dying in the healthcare field, I think that there's lots more learning that can occur within health professionals. And really what I'm seeing is a change in MAiD care to one that's moving somewhat from an access focused to MAiD care. There was a lot of early on what I was hearing and seeing, not that I was providing, but what I heard was really autonomy, choice. Make sure that you meet that autonomous choice that the person's made. And that's pretty reasonable in the majority of circumstances, because when MAiD first started, as you know, it was limited to a reasonably foreseeable natural deaths, which was typically somebody at the end stage of their life after multiple different medical interventions occurred. They were suffering. And my understanding in talking with people in society is it's what everybody thought it was, like widespread cancer, lots of treatment provided. They were suffering. Their death was likely going to occur within a short period of time, unclear exactly, and that occurred. I think since that time, with greater understanding and with change in legislation, I think there has been, again, a focus in the earlier days of access, making sure that there is access available, making sure that it meets the desired request of the requester. There seems to be more work occurring. There never was not work. There's more occurring where providers and assessors are trying to understand, are there other things? Is there something that can be done differently to help that requester to look at things or to experience things or to have other treatment that may not have been thought of before in more of a holistic approach to the care and the assessment? So I think that's what I'm seeing happening. It's less of the moving from a procedurally focused access to MAiD care. And that, I think, is a really valuable. I think that will come with more experience, more knowledge in MAiD and where does it fit into the healthcare system. We think about many of the medical procedures, they're not developed because legislation's changed. They're developed by medicine learning about something, developing it within the healthcare system, bringing it forward, learning about that, improving and changing as you proceed over the time. I think that that's happening within MAiD as in the healthcare learning that occurs with a procedure within healthcare or with a process within healthcare. So I think that's happening. And I think people started in the best way that they could and continue to be thoughtful, compassionate, caring for the patients, and now learning about how can you enhance your compassion and your caring for that patient in a way that's thinking about how do you work together with patients. And then, as I think was asked earlier, families and family contribution in the process. Sometimes systems have not been kind to people, and that puts a person in a situation, not to say that MAiD is their choice, not because they're choosing one or another, but the systems and the process hasn't been what it might be for somebody else. And recognizing that, the patient may not recognize that. And so helping the patient to see that and see that there are other opportunities, then that's the other way to think about how to do things a little bit differently.
And I feel strongly about attaching the word care to MAiD, and that it's not solely a procedure, that there's much more from the front loading of education for people to know how it's accessible, the safety components that you have unpacked today, letting us know about the data that your office collects that form the recommendations. Again, that idea that there's power in death, that we can learn to improve how we care for others. And so, Dirk, you alluded at the beginning of our conversation to some reports that are coming out. Can you let our listeners know what reports they can access and where they might be able to find them?
Well, we don't have any reports out yet, but
they're coming.
The MAiD Death Review Committee has in the works of three reports. One where we're looking at the complexities that occur specifically in Track 2 cases, and also looking at waivers of final consent. How are they applied and utilized in Track 1 cases? So those are the kinds of areas that we're going to explore in the reports. We're also going to release our data in a systematic way in all of 2023. And then we're also looking at some degrees of analysis of some of the information that we've collected to try to understand where does MAiD fit in with other healthcare challenges that might be present. So those are a number of reports that will be hopefully coming out in the next number of weeks, depending on final reviews by a number of experts. They'd be publicly available, hopefully through our website, but they certainly will be available through the MAiD review team and shared publicly with all of those who would be potentially respondent to the recommendations, because some of the reports will have recommendations for potential consideration for change in practice or practice enhancements. Also, there will be information that allows people to see the numbers and the types of deaths that occur.
That is great to hear. So thank you so very much, Dr. Huyer, for speaking with us today. Okay, Keri, can I just say, I got to say, speak for the dead to protect the living. I love that.
I was very proud of you that you worked that in there. And yes, and as a long-time viewer of a British show called Silent Witness, I believe that's the show's tagline. So we really served ourselves well there. Well done.
I think so, but more seriously, we tend to be arguably, and we can argue about this another time, a bit of a death-denying, death-defying society. But to know that in Ontario, and I suspect in other provinces as well, that there is an office that pays attention to how people die and thinks about how can we make it so, and what can we learn from those deaths that's going to help us to live better, not just as it relates to MAiD, but as it relates to many aspects of our life, I think is so important.
I do too. And some of the nuggets that I'm really hanging on to and processing right now is this idea of where in the past, as a layperson, I have been one of the first people to say, why aren't we seeing MAiD on the death certificate? What's that about? Is that covert practice, etc.? Now realizing why we're not seeing it, and more to the point, what value added would it be to see it on a death certificate when we have other ways of understanding who is being provided with MAiD in Ontario? I really appreciated Dr. Huyer's ability to frame some of those things that I carry around, even in the spaces that I dwell in, where I'm reading and analyzing MAiD access and provision all the time.
Agreed. The other piece that, again, to hear from him, to articulate, is the safety protocols that are in place, that the oversight around medical assistance in dying that happens. And of course, we know that there's 2 assessors before the MAiD provision happens, but to then know after the death what happens, that there is a team of registered nurses out there reviewing each death that happened to make sure that it falls under what we think is good MAiD care. And I was also really happy to hear Dr. Huyer talk about MAiD care and recognizing that we need to be paying attention to the kind of care that can be affiliated with end-of-life care that MAiD is a part of.
I would agree with you. I like that shift. Let's perhaps not focus so much so on the issue of choice, and really let's think about how those things are looking from a human experience perspective is certainly what I inferred. What is actually happening within that assessment and those assessment and provision spaces? As a layperson, I was very quick to carry the torch for access. And as you and I have discussed, of course, access is a bit of a crapshoot in Canada because of where we happen to be in terms of geography. But I think this emphasis on care, as you say, is very important at this point, 8 years into the legislation.
And I also like the idea of after-death care. And we talk about that in terms of grief, in terms of rituals that surround death. But I also like this idea that, from my lens, the Office of the Chief Coroner does is after-death care in terms of paying attention to how we die and what we can learn from that and how we can do things better. And so I know for me, there's lots of food for thought regarding this. And dear listeners, we will link to those reports in our socials and on our website when they are released, because I think that that's important. I think we need to make sure that we are informed about who's accessing MAiD, how they're accessing it, and what kind of recommendations a group of people who spend time in this space thinking critically and wanting to do things better for us all will make to move the practice of MAiD care forward.
Really.
So finally, our last plea, if you questions, not just people that you want us to speak to, but if you have actual questions about MAiD that maybe we haven't answered yet or you want us to follow up on, please let us know. Engage with us on social media. Drop us an email at disruptingdeath.ca. We'd love to hear from you, and let's keep those conversations going.
When did we get here, and how your stories mean everything now? When did we get here, and how your stories mean everything now? Your stories mean